The bar buzzed with weekend energy, the air thick with laughter, the clinking of glasses, and the faint smell of fried food drifting from the kitchen. Emily sat at a small table near the edge of the crowd, her hands wrapped around a glass of soda she hadn't touched in 20 minutes. She had come reluctantly, persuaded by her coworkers who insisted she needed to get out more, but now, watching them disappear into the crowd of dancers and loud conversations, she regretted saying yes. She wasn't built for places like this. Her nature was quiet, reserved, preferring coffee shops and books to booming music and flashing neon lights. Yet here she was, trying her best not to stand out, though the attempt proved futile when a group of men at a nearby table noticed her. At first, their attention came in the form of smiles and casual comments tossed across the space, but when Emily didn't respond the way they expected, their remarks sharpened. They mocked her drink choice, sneering at the fact she wasn't touching alcohol, and laughed at her simple dress, as though her modesty were an open invitation for ridicule. The men's voices grew louder with each joke, attracting the attention of others nearby who cast curious glances toward the scene. Emily's cheeks burned, her pulse quickening as she tried to shrink into her seat, hoping the floor might swallow her whole. She thought about leaving, about slipping out quietly, but fear of walking past the men and hearing more cutting words pinned her in place. She clenched her glass tighter, her throat dry, wishing someone, anyone, would intervene, though she knew from experience that strangers rarely did. Across the room, however, there was someone who had been watching from the moment she walked in. James sat alone in a corner booth, his tall frame bent over a glass of water, his expression unreadable. He wasn't here to drink or socialize, he rarely was. As a single father raising a young daughter, nights out were rare, and even when they happened, he kept to himself. But the sight of Emily being singled out by the group of men stirred something in him. He recognized the subtle panic in her eyes, the way she tried to laugh off the humiliation without drawing more attention to herself, and it ignited a protective instinct he hadn't expected to feel. For years, he had lived quietly, avoiding confrontation, but tonight he knew he couldn't just sit back. His daughter's face flashed in his mind. What if she were grown and found herself in this very situation, cornered by laughter and cruelty? Wouldn't he hope someone would stand for her? The decision was made before he realized it, his body moving on instinct. As Emily shifted uncomfortably, trying to ignore the men, James pushed his chair back and rose to his feet, his steady gaze fixed on the table of mockers. The noise of the bar seemed to fade around him as he crossed the room, each step purposeful, carrying with it a quiet resolve that no one expected from the man who had sat unnoticed all evening. James reached the table where Emily sat, his tall figure casting a shadow over the group of men who had been laughing at her expense, and for a brief second, the noise of the entire bar seemed to fall away. He didn't slam his fists on the table or raise his voice. Instead, his calm but commanding tone carried more weight than anger ever could as he said evenly, "That's enough. Leave her alone." The men exchanged glances, their smirks faltering at the unexpected interruption, and one of them leaned back in his chair with a sneer, trying to recover his bravado. "Who asked you, pal?" "We're just having a little fun," he said, but James's steady gaze didn't waver. He had the kind of presence that didn't need shouting. His silence, his stillness, and the steel in his eyes were enough to make them shift uneasily in their seats. Emily's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't expected anyone to step in, least of all a stranger who seemed so unassuming moments ago. The men tried to laugh again, louder this time, to mask the crack in their confidence, but the bartender, who had been watching the exchange nervously, stepped forward as if to back James, emboldened by his quiet stand. "You heard him," the bartender said, voice firmer now, "knock it off or you'll be out." The sneering man's smirk faded completely, and though a few muttered curses slipped under their breath, the group decided it wasn't worth the trouble and turned their attention elsewhere. Relief swept through Emily like a wave, though her heart still pounded in her chest. James didn't gloat or linger on the men who had been silenced. Instead, he turned to her, his expression softening, his voice gentler now as he asked, "Are you okay?" The simplicity of the question nearly undid her. After all the humiliation she had endured in silence, someone had finally acknowledged her pain without making a show of it. She nodded quickly, her voice catching as she whispered, "Yes, thank you." James gave a small nod, as if to say no thanks was needed, and for a moment it seemed like he might walk away, retreat back into the anonymity of his corner booth. But then, instead of leaving, he pulled out the chair across from her and sat down, his movements calm and deliberate, like he didn't want to frighten her further. Emily blinked in surprise, unsure of what to say, but strangely comforted by his presence. The noise of the bar filled in again, people returning to their conversations, but to her, it all felt muted now. All she noticed was the quiet man who had stepped forward when no one else would, who carried himself with the kind of strength that didn't need to prove itself. For the first time that night, Emily felt a flicker of safety, and as she looked at him, she couldn't help but wonder who this man was, and why he, of all people, had chosen to stand up for her. The men at the bar weren't used to being challenged, especially not by someone who spoke with such calm certainty, and for a moment they hesitated, as though unsure whether to push back or back down. One of them, clearly emboldened by the alcohol in his system, leaned forward with narrowed eyes and muttered something about James minding his own business, but James didn't flinch, didn't move, didn't even blink. His stillness was more intimidating than anger could ever be, and slowly the bravado of the group cracked. They muttered curses under their breath, but when the bartender crossed his arms and gave them a warning look, they finally scoffed and turned away, pretending to lose interest. Emily sat frozen, her heart still pounding, but as the tension dissolved around her, she felt the sting of humiliation give way to something else, relief, gratitude, and a strange sense of safety she hadn't felt in a long time. James didn't look at the men again, he focused only on her, his eyes gentle now, the hardness in his expression melting into quiet concern. "They won't bother you again," he said softly, and Emily found herself nodding though her throat felt tight. She had spent so long trying to blend in, trying not to draw attention, that the idea of someone defending her felt foreign, almost overwhelming. She expected him to walk away after that, to return to the shadows of the bar where he had sat unnoticed all evening, but instead he stayed, sitting across from her with a kind of unshakable calm that steadied her breathing. They sat in silence at first, the air between them heavy with unspoken words, until finally Emily found the courage to whisper, "You didn't have to do that." James shook his head, his voice low but firm as he replied, "Yes, I did." It was said so simply, with such conviction, that it silenced her doubts. The conversation that followed was halting at first, awkward introductions, cautious words, but slowly, it unfolded into something more. She told him about her work, about how she often felt out of place in social gatherings like this, while he shared fragments of his life as a single father, raising a young daughter on his own after losing his wife. There was no pity in his voice when he spoke of his hardships, only quiet strength, and Emily found herself drawn to that steadiness, the way he carried his pain without bitterness. As the minutes turned into an hour, she realized she wasn't thinking about the men anymore or the laughter that had cut her so deeply. Instead, she was listening to this man whose presence felt like an anchor in the storm. Around them, the bar returned to its usual chaos, but at their table, it was as though a small pocket of peace had been carved out, one where she didn't feel judged, mocked, or out of place. And though she barely knew him, Emily felt something she hadn't felt in years, a fragile, flickering hope that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as alone in the world as she had always believed. When the night finally drew to a close, Emily found herself surprised at how reluctant she was to leave the quiet corner she now shared with James, a man who just hours ago had been a stranger but now felt like someone she had known far longer. The fear and humiliation that had threatened to ruin her evening had been replaced by a strange warmth that lingered as they talked, and when the clock ticked past midnight, James offered, without hesitation, to walk her to her car. She agreed, grateful for his presence, and together they stepped out into the cool night air, the muffled noise of the bar fading behind them. The parking lot was mostly empty, and Emily felt a familiar unease creep in at the sight of shadows stretching across the asphalt, but James walked beside her with quiet assurance, his steady pace and calm demeanor keeping her nerves at bay. When they reached her car, she turned to thank him again, but her words faltered when she saw the sincerity in his eyes. "You don't owe me anything," he said gently, as though he had read her thoughts, "but, if you'd like, maybe we could meet somewhere quieter next time. A coffee shop, maybe. Emily's lips curved into the first genuine smile she had worn all evening, and after a moment's hesitation, she nodded. I'd like that, she whispered, her voice steadier than before. Over the next few weeks, that simple suggestion turned into reality, and soon their quiet meetings over coffee became the highlight of Emily's days. She learned more about James's world, his little daughter, Lily, who adored art and bedtime stories, and his struggles of balancing fatherhood with work while carrying the weight of loss. In turn, James learned about Emily's quiet resilience, her loneliness masked by politeness, and her determination to find her place in a world that often felt unkind. When Emily finally met Lily, the bond was instant and natural, the little girl slipping her small hand into hers as if she had always belonged there. For James, watching the two of them together stirred something in him he had long buried, the hope of a new beginning, the possibility of letting someone into the walls he had built around his heart. For Emily, being welcomed into their little world gave her the sense of family and belonging she had secretly yearned for but never believed she would find. Looking back, it amazed them both how a night that had started with cruelty had shifted the course of their lives, how a moment of quiet courage had turned humiliation into connection. That bar had been a place of mockery and pain, but it had also been the place where two lonely souls collided in the most unexpected way. Standing in James's kitchen weeks later, Emily laughed as Lily proudly showed her a crayon drawing of Daddy and Emily, and James, watching from the doorway, realized he wasn't the quiet, solitary man he once thought he'd always be. He had found his voice, his strength, and perhaps even his future, and it had all begun the night he chose to stand up and simply say, "That's enough."